The Town Poor. A short story by Sarah O. Jewett. Mrs. William Trimble and Miss Rebecca Wright were driving along Hampton East Road one afternoon in early spring. Their progress was slow. Mrs. Trimble's sorrel horse was old and stiff, and the wheels were clogged by day mud. The frost was not yet out of the ground, although the snow was nearly gone, except in a few places on the north side of the woods, or where it had drifted all winter against a length of fence. "There must be a good deal of snow to the nor'ard of us yet," said weather-wise Mrs. Trimble. "I feel it in the air. 'Tis more than the ground damp. We ain't going to have real nice weather till the up-country snow's all gone." "I heard say yesterday that there was good sledding yet, all up through Parsley," responded Miss Wright. "I shouldn't like to live in them northern places. My cousin Ellen's husband was a Parsley man, and he was obliged, as you may have heard, to go up north to his father's second wife's funeral. Got back day before yesterday. 'Twas about 21 miles and they started on wheels, but when they'd gone 9 or 10 miles they found it was no sort of use and left their wagon and took a sleigh. The man that owned it charged 'em 4 and 6 too. I shouldn't have thought he would. They told him they was going to a funeral, and they had their own buffaloes and everything. Well, I expect it's a good deal harder scratching up that way. They have to get money where they can. The farms is very poor as you go north," suggested Mrs. Trimble kindly. "'Tain't none too rich a country where we be, but I've always been grateful I wa'n't born up to Parsley." The old horse plodded along, and the sun, coming out from the heavy spring clouds, sent a sudden shine of light along the muddy road. Sister Wright drew her large veil forward over the high brim of her bonnet. She was not used to driving or to being much in the open air, but Mrs. Trimble was an active businesswoman and looked after her own affairs herself in all weathers. The late Mr. Trimble had left her a good farm, but not much ready money, and it was often said that she was better off in the end than if he had lived. She regretted his loss deeply, however. It was impossible for her to speak of him, even to intimate friends, without emotion, and nobody had ever hinted that this emotion was insincere. She was most warm-hearted and generous, and in her limited way played the part of Lady Bountiful in the town of Hampton. "Why, there's where the Bray girls lives, ain't it?" she exclaimed, as beyond a thicket of witch hazel and scrub oak, they came in sight of a weather-beaten, solitary farmhouse. The barn was too far away for thrift or comfort, and they could see long lines of light between the shrunken boards as they came nearer. The fields looked both stony and sodden. Somehow, even Parsley itself could be hardly more forlorn. "Yes'm," said Miss Wright. "That's where they live now, poor things. I know the place, though I ain't been up here for years. You don't suppose, Miss Trimble, I ain't seen the girls out to meetin' all winter. I've really been covetin'." "Why, yes, Rebecca, of course we could stop," answered Mrs. Trimble heartily. "The exercises was over earlier than I expected, and you're going to remain overnight longer me, you know. There won't be no tea till we get there, so we can't be late. I'm in the habit of sending a basket to the Bray girls when any of our folks is coming this way, but I ain't been to see 'em since they moved up here. Why, it must be a good deal over a year ago. I know it was in the late winter they had to make the move. 'Twas cruel hard, I must say, and if I hadn't been down with my pleurisy fever, I'd have stirred round and done something about it. There was a good deal of sickness at the time, and, well, it was kind of rushed through, breaking of 'em up, and lots of folks blamed the selectmen. But when it was done, and nobody took holt to undo it. Anne and Mandy looked same's ever when they come to meeting. Long in the summer, kind of wishful perhaps. They've always sent me word they was getting on pretty comfortable." "That would be their way," said Rebecca Wright. "They never was any hand to complain, though Mandy's less cheerful than Anne. If Mandy'd been spared such poor eyesight, and Anne hadn't got her lame wrist that wa'n't set right, they'd kep off the town fast enough. They both shed tears when they talked to me about having to break up when I went to see 'em before I went over to Brother Ace's. You see, we was brought up neighbours, and we went to school together, the Brays and me. 'Twas a special providence brought us home this road. I've been so coveting a chance to get to see 'em. My lameness hampers me." "I'm glad we come this way myself," said Mrs. Trimble. "I'd like to see just how they fare," Miss Rebecca Wright continued. "They give their consent to going on the town because they knew they'd got to be dependent, and so they felt it would come easier for all than for a few to help 'em. They acted real dignified and right-minded, contrary to what most do in such cases. But they was dreadful anxious to see who would bid 'em off, town meeting day. They did so hope it would be somebody right in the village. I just sat down and cried good when I found Abel James's folks had got hold of 'em. They always had the name of being slack and poor-spirited, and they did it just for what they got out of the town. The selectmen this last year ain't what we have had. I hope they've been considerate about the Bray girls. I should have been more considerate about fetching of you over, apologised Mrs. Trimble. I've got my horse, and you are lame-footed. 'Tis too far for you to come, but time does slip away with busy folks, and I forget a good deal I ought to remember. There's nobody more considerate than you be, protested Miss Rebecca Wright. Mrs. Trimble made no answer, but took out her whip and gently touched the sorrel horse, who walked considerably faster, but did not think it worth while to trot. It was a long, roundabout way to the house, farther down the road and up a lane. I never had any opinion of the Bray girl's father, leaving 'em as he did, said Mrs. Trimble. He was much praised in his time, though there was always some said his early life hadn't been up to the mark, explained her companion. He was a great favourite of our then preacher, the Reverend Daniel Longbrother. They did a good deal for the parish, but they did it their own way. Deacon Bray was one that did his part in the repairs without urging. You know it was in his time the first repairs was made, when they got out the old sounding board and them handsome square pews. It cost an awful sight of money too. They hadn't done paying up that debt when they set to alter it again and get the walls frescoed. My grandmother was one that always spoke her mind right out, and she was dreadful opposed to breaking up the square pews where she'd always set. They was counting up what it would cost in parish meeting, and she riz right up and said it wouldn't cost nothing to let 'em stay. And there warn't a house carpenter left in the parish that could do such nice work. And time would come when the great-grandchildren would give their eye-teeth to have the old meeting-house look just as it did then. But haul the inside to pieces they would and did. There come to be a real fight over it, didn't there? Agreed Mrs. Trimble soothingly. Well, it warn't good taste. I remember the old house well. I come here as a child to visit a cousin of mother's, and Mr. Trimble's folks was neighbours, and we was drawed to each other then, youngs we was. Mr. Trimble spoke of it many's the time, that first time he ever see me, in a leghorn hat with a feather. 'Twas one that mother had and pressed over. When I think of them old sermons that used to be preached in that old meeting-house of all, I'm glad it's altered over, so's not to remind folks, said Miss Rebecca Wright after a suitable pause. Them old brimstone discourses, you know, Miss Trimble. Preachers is far more reasonable nowadays. Why, I set and thought last Sabbath, as I listened, that if old Mr. Longbrother and Deacon Bray could hear the difference, they'd crack the ground over 'em like pole beans and come right up alongside their headstones. Mrs. Trimble laughed heartily and shook the reins 3 or 4 times by way of emphasis. There's no getting round you, she said, much pleased. I should think Deacon Bray would want to rise anyway, if it was so he could, and knew how his poor girls was faring. A man ought to provide for his folks he's got to leave behind him, especially if they're women. To be sure they had their little home, but we've seen how, with all their industrious ways, they hadn't means to keep it. I suppose he thought he'd got time enough to lay by when he gives so generous in collections, but he didn't lay by, and there they be. He might have took lessons from the squirrels. Even them little wild creators makes them their winter hoards, and men folks ought to know enough if squirrels does. Be just before you are generous. That's what was always set for the bees in the copybooks when I was to school, and it often runs through my mind. As for man, his days are as grass. That was for A. The two go well together, added Miss Rebecca Wright soberly. My good gracious, ain't this a starved-looking place? It makes me ache to think them nice Bray girls has to brook it here. The sorrel horse, though somewhat puzzled by an unexpected deviation from his homeward way, willingly came to a stand by the gnawed corner of the dooryard fence, which evidently served as hitching place. 2 or 3 ragged old hens were picking about the yard, and at last a face appeared at the kitchen window, tied up in a handkerchief, as if it were a case of toothache. By the time our friends reached the side door next this window, Mrs. Janes came disconsolately to open it for them, shutting it again as soon as possible, though the air felt more chilly inside the house. "Take seats," said Mrs. Janes briefly. "You'll have to see me just as I be. I have been suffering these 4 days with the ague and everything to do. Mr. Janes is to court, on the jury. 'T was inconvenient to spare him. I should be pleased to have you lay off your things." "Comfortable, Mrs." Trimble looked about the cheerless kitchen and could not think of anything to say. So she smiled blandly and shook her head in answer to the invitation. "We'll just set a few minutes with you to pass the time of day, and then we must go in and have a word with the Miss Brays, be an old acquaintance. It ain't been so we could get to call on 'em before. I don't know's you're acquainted with Miss Rebecca Wright. She's been out of town a good deal." "I heard she was stopping over to Plainfields with her brother's folks," replied Mrs. Janes, rocking herself with irregular motion as she sat close to the stove. "Got back some time in the fall, I believe." "Yes'm," said Miss Rebecca with an undue sense of guilt and conviction. "We've been to the installation over to the East Parish and thought we'd stop in. We took this road home to see if it was any better. How is the Miss Brays getting on?" "They're Wells Common," answered Mrs. Janes grudgingly. "I was put out with Mr. Janes for fetching of 'em here, with all I've got to do, and I own I was kind of surly to 'em long to the first of it. He gets the money from the town and it helps him out. But he bid 'em off for $5 a month, and we can't do much for 'em at no such price as that. I went and dealt with the selectmen, and made 'em promise to find their firewood and some other things extra. They was glad to get rid of the matter the 4th time I went, and would have promised most anything. But Mr. Janes don't keep me half the time in Ovenwood. He's off so much, and we was cramped a room anyway. I have to store things up garret a good deal, and that keeps me tramping right through their room. I do the best for 'em I can, Miss Trimble, but it ain't so easy for me as it is for you, with all your means to do with." The poor woman looked pinched and miserable herself, though it was evident that she had no gift at house or home-keeping. Mrs. Trimble's heart was wrung with pain as she thought of the unwelcome inmates of such a place. But she held her peace bravely, while Miss Rebecca again gave some brief information in regard to the installation. "You go right up them back stairs," the hostess directed at last. "I'm glad some of you church folks has seen fit to come and visit 'em. There ain't been nobody here this long spell, and they've aged a sight since they come. They always send down a taste out of your baskets, Miss Trimble, and I relish it, I tell you. I'll shut the door after you if you don't object. I feel every draught of cold air. I've always heard she was a great hand to make a poor mouth. Wa'n't she from somewheres up Parsley way?" whispered Miss Rebecca as they stumbled in the half-light. "Poor meechin' body wherever she come from," replied Mrs. Trimble as she knocked at the door. There was silence for a moment after this unusual sound. Then one of the Bray sisters opened the door. The eager guests stared into a small, low room, brown with age and grey too, as if former dust and cobwebs could not be made wholly to disappear. The 2 elderly women who stood there looked like captives. Their withered faces wore a look of apprehension, and the room itself was more bare and plain than was fitting to their evident refinement of character and self-respect. There was an uncovered small table in the middle of the floor, with some crackers on a plate, and for some reason or other, this added a great deal to the general desolation. But Miss Anne Bray, the elder sister, who carried her right arm in a sling with piteously drooping fingers, gazed at the visitors with radiant joy. She had not seen them arrive. The one window gave only the view at the back of the house across the fields, and their coming was indeed a surprise. The next minute she was laughing and crying together. "Oh, sister," she said, "if here ain't our dear Miss Trimble. And my heart o' goodness, it is Becca Wright too. What dear good creatures you be. I've felt all day as if something good was going to happen, and was just saying to myself it was most sundown now, but I wouldn't let on to Mandani I'd give up hope quite yet. You see, the scissors stuck in the floor this very morning, and it's always a reliable sign. There, I've got to kiss you both again." "I don't know where we can all set," lamented Sister Mandana. "There ain't but the one chair in the bed. T'other chair's too rickety, and we've been promised another these 10 days. But first they forgot it, and next Miss Janes can't spare it. One excuse and another. I am going to get a stump of wood and nail a board onto it when I can get outdoor again," said Mandana in a plaintive voice. "There, I ain't going to complain of nothing now you've come, she added. And the guests sat down, Mrs. Trimble, as was proper, in the one chair. We've sat on the bed many's the time with you, Beaker, and talked over our girl nonsense, ain't we? You know where it was. In the little back bedroom we had when we was girls, and used to peek out at our beau through the strings o' morning glories, laughed Anne Bray delightedly, her thin face shining more and more with joy. I brought some of them morning glory seeds along when we come away. We'd raised 'em so many years, and we got 'em started all right, but the hens found 'em out. I declare I chased them poor hens, foolish as it was, but the morning glories I'd counted on a sight to remind me o' home. You see, our debts was so large after my long sickness and all that we didn't feel it was right to keep back anything we could help from the auction. It was impossible for anyone to speak for a moment or two. The sisters felt their own uprooted condition afresh, and their guests for the first time really comprehended the piteous contrast between that neat little village house, which now seemed a palace of comfort, and this cold, unpainted upper room in the remote Jane's farmhouse. It was an unwelcome thought to Mrs. Trimble that the well-to-do town of Hampton could provide no better for its poor than this, and her round face flushed with resentment and the shame of personal responsibility. The girls shall be well settled in the village before another winter, if I pay their board myself, she made an inward resolution, and took another almost tearful look at the broken stove, the miserable bed, and the sisters' one hair-covered trunk, on which Mandana was sitting. But the poor place was filled with a golden spirit of hospitality. Rebecca was again discoursing eloquently of the installation. It was so much easier to speak of general subjects, and the sisters had evidently been longing to hear some news. Since the late summer they had not been to church, and presently Mrs. Trimble asked the reason. "Now don't you go to pouring out our woes, Mandy," begged little old Anne, looking shy and almost girlish, and as if she insisted upon playing that life was still all before them and all pleasure. "Don't you go to spoiling their visit with our complaints. They know well's we do that changes must come, and we'd been so wanted to our home things that this come hard at first, but then they felt for us. I know just as well's can be. 'Twill soon be summer again, and it is real pleasant right out in the fields here, when there ain't too hot a spell. I've got to know a sight o' singing birds since we come." "Give me the folks I've always known," sighed the younger sister, who looked older than Miss Anne, and less even-tempered. "You may have your birds if you want 'em. I do really long to go to meetin' and see folks go by up the aisle. Now, I will speak of it, Anne, whatever you say. We need, each of us, a pair of good stout shoes and rubbers. Ours are all wore out, and we've asked, and they never think to bring 'em, and—" Poor old Mandana, on the trunk, covered her face with her arms and sobbed aloud. The elder sister stood over her and patted her on the thin shoulder like a child, and tried to comfort her. It crossed Mrs. Trimble's mind that it was not the first time one had wept, and the other had comforted. The sad scene must have been repeated many times in that long, drear winter. She would see them forever after in her mind as fixed as a picture, and her own tears fell fast. "You didn't see Miss James's cunning little boy, the next one to the baby, did you?" asked Anne Bray, turning round quickly at last and going cheerfully on with the conversation. "Now, hush, Mandy dear. They'll think you're childish. He's a dear, friendly little creature, and likes to stay with us a good deal, though we feel as if it was too cold for him, now we are waiting to get us more wood." "When I think of the acres of woodland in this town," groaned Rebecca Wright, "I believe I'm going to preach next Sunday, 'stead of the minister, and I'll make the sparks fly. I've always heard the saying, 'What's everybody's business is nobody's business,' and I've come to believe it." "Now don't you, Becca. You've happened on a kind of a poor time with us, but we've got more belongings than you see here, and a good large closet where we can store those things there ain't room to have about. You and Miss Trimble have happened on a kind of poor day, you know. Soon's I get me some stout shoes and rubbers, as Mandy says, I can fetch home plenty o' little dry boughs o' pine. You remember I was always a great hand to roam in the woods. If we could only have a front room, so we could look out on the road and see Parson and was shod for meetin', I don't know's we should complain. Now we're just going to give you what we've got, and make out with a good welcome. We make more tea and we want in the morning, and then let the fire go down, since it has been so mild. We've got a good closet," disappearing as she spoke. "And I know this to be good tea, 'cause it's some of yourn, Miss Trimble. And here's our sprigged chiny cups that Rebecca knows by sight, if Miss Trimble don't. We kep out 4 of 'em, and put the even half-dozen with the rest of the auction stuff. I've often wondered who'd got 'em, but I never asked for fear it would be somebody that would distress us. They was Mother's, you know." The 4 cups were poured, and the little table pushed to the bed, where Rebecca Wright still sat, and Mandana, wiping her eyes, came and joined her. Mrs. Trimble sat in her chair at the end, and Anne trotted about the room in pleased content for a while, and in and out of the closet, as if she still had much to do. Then she came and stood opposite Mrs. Trimble. She was very short and small, and there was no painful sense of her being obliged to stand. The 4 cups were not quite full of cold tea, but there was a clean old tablecloth folded double, and a plate with 3 pairs of crackers neatly piled, and a small, it must be owned, a very small, piece of hard white cheese. Then, for a treat, in a glass dish, there was a little preserved peach, the last, Miss Rebecca knew it instinctively, of the household stores brought from their old home. It was very sugary, this bit of peach, and as she helped her guests and Sister Mandy, Miss Anne Bray said half unconsciously, as she often had said with less reason in the old days, "Our preserves ain't so good as usual this year. This is beginning to candy." Both the guests protested, while Rebecca added that the taste of it carried her back and made her feel young again. The Brays had always managed to keep 1 or 2 peach trees alive in their corner of a garden. "I've been keeping this preserve for a treat," said her friend. "I'm glad to have you eat some, Becca. Last summer I often wished you was home and could come and see us, instead of being away off to Plainfields." The crackers did not taste too dry. Miss Anne took the last of the peach on her own cracker. There could not have been quite a small spoonful after the others were helped, but she asked them first if they would not have some more. Then there was a silence, and in the silence a wave of tender feeling rose high in the hearts of the 4 elderly women. At this moment the setting sun flooded the poor plain room with light. The unpainted wood was all of a golden brown, and Anne Bray, with her grey hair and aged face, stood at the head of the table in a kind of aureole. Mrs. Trimble's face was all a quiver as she looked at her. She thought of the text about 2 or 3 being gathered together, and was half afraid. "I believe we ought to have asked Miss Janes if she wouldn't come up," said Anne. "She's real good feeling, but she's had it very hard and gets discouraged. I can't find that she's ever had anything real pleasant to look back to, as we have. There, next time we'll make a good heartening time for her too." The sorrel horse had taken a long nap by the gnawed fence rail, and the cool air after sundown made him impatient to be gone. The 2 friends jolted homeward in the gathering darkness, through the stiffening mud, and neither Mrs. Trimble nor Rebecca. Wright said a word until they were out of sight as well as out of sound of the Janes' house. Time must elapse before they could reach a more familiar part of the road and resume conversation on its natural level. "I consider myself to blame," insisted Mrs. Trimble at last. "I haven't no words of accusation for nobody else, and I ain't one to take comfort in calling names to the Board of Selectmen. I make no reproaches, and I take it all on my own shoulders, but I'm going to stir about me, I tell you. I shall begin early tomorrow. They're going back to their own house. It's been standing empty all winter, and the town's going to give 'em the rent and what firewood they need. It won't come to more than the board's paying out now, and you and me'll take this same horse and wagon, and ride and go afoot by turns, and get means enough together to buy back their furniture and whatever was sold at that plaguey auction. And then we'll put it all back, and tell 'em they've got to move to a new place, and just carry 'em right back again where they come from. And don't you never tell, Rebecca, but here I be a widow woman, laying up what I make from my farm for nobody knows who, and I'm going to do for them Bray girls all I'm a mind to. I should be scout to wake up in heaven and hear anybody there ask how the Bray girls was. Don't talk to me about the town of Hampton, and don't ever let me hear the name of town poor. I'm ashamed to go home and see what's set out for supper. I wish I'd brought 'em right along." "I was going to ask if we couldn't get the new doctor to go up and do something for poor Anne's arm," said Miss Rebecca. "They say he's very smart. If she could get so's to braid straw or hook rugs again, she'd soon be earning a little something. And maybe he could do something for Mandy's eyes. They did used to live so neat and ladylike. Somehow I couldn't speak to tell 'em there that it was I bought them 6 best cups and saucers time of the auction. They went very low, as everything else did, and I thought I could save it some other way. They shall have 'em back and welcome. You're real wholehearted, Miss Trimble. I expect Anne'll be saying that her father's child'n wa'n't going to be left desolate, and that all the bread he cast on the water's coming back through you. I don't care what she says, dear creature, exclaimed Mrs. Trimble. I'm full of regrets I took time for that installation and set there seeping in a lot of talk this whole day long, except for it's kind of bringing us to the Bray girls. I wish to my heart it was tomorrow morning already and I a starting for the selectsman.